So what claim do you want to talk about that you believe in?
I believe that as a person of color and as a person who is racialized under like patriarchal and capitalist society, I believe there's no separation between, you could say, people of different groups. There's no separation between people who are African, Latin American, or Asian. I believe that everybody who is not white is automatically black by virtue of their positionality within racist, imperialist, capitalist society.
I don't want to go.
So you're saying that due to the construct of how society is and because of like colonialism, basically if you are now white, therefore everyone can be lumped into one group, into one category.
Yeah.
And in a way, are you saying that despite like maybe there be cultural differences, like you mentioned people like from an Asian people from Asia, Africa, Latin America, yeah, we're all now white, but do you think culturally we could be like a little different, and maybe that's why people don't kind of put like all of us or all of those people from those countries in one pile? Is it because of culture, or why do you think people don't put us together into one group?
Well, I think like we need to ask which people don't put us together. I do think it's the white man first who invented all of these categories of differentiation and you would say difference between groups of people. The white man was the first person to say that people, for example, from Spain and Latin America were the same, they were Hispanic, or that African people were different from people who are African American, or that people from, for example, from Philippines were different from people from, example, Vietnam, in that sense. As soon as you get like a system that is based on the differentiation of races, the white person, the white man, person from Europe and America and Canada, and you can include Japan into that as a oppression, like a nation that oppresses other peoples and racializes their identities. These were the people that in their systems, right, of segregation and apartheid, they were the ones that introduced all of these categories of separation. They were the ones that said Hispanic, Black, Asian, Native American, or Indian. They first called them Indians, of course, right? Why do they do this system of separation? Why would it be more convenient for them to separate us? Because I suppose it may be simplistic to say it this way, but like the way they want to further their systems of oppression is by dividing and conquering people, right? That's what the Americans did in Vietnam. They separated the Vietnamese people from the Cambodian people, and the Cambodian people from the Vietnamese, and so and so. They separated, for example, the Korean people
from the Chinese. Were any of those distinctions organic before colonialism?
That's the thing. Like in that region of Indochina, because it was known as Indochina before, the people were really close together. There were cultural differences, like you said, and there are cultural differences among each and every single you could say, group. But I feel under colonialism and imperialism, those differences tend to be, you could say, put on the table for the sake of exploitation, right? And at the same time, those differences are put on the table because you, for example, by virtue of having these systems or these categories of Asian person, you don't highlight the differences among people, and at the same time, you're trying to lump them in a single group, right? And also divide them from other groups, from other places, right? Like the people from Africa. For example, and maybe this is a little bit sensitive topic, right? But the reason that for example, America finds it so easy to divide, for example, the people, you could say the Middle East, if again by introducing all of these systems of differentiation, right? And of course, debilitation by that. When you divide, for example, a person from Iraq from a person from Palestine, and a person from Palestine from a person from Yemen, you find it so much easier to go to a country, like kill every single person there, and the other person from the other countries don't find that much, you could say, trouble because they're not that group that is being, you could say, oppressed. That is how America operates, by dividing people and conquering them.
I understand the strategic aspect for sure, but I think historically, like, there have been distinctions, in not just within the regions, but if you talk about broader, your claim, if I'm not mistaken, was that everyone who's not white is black. Like, isn't there a lot of anti-blackness among these non-white groups? Because, if you asked me 10 years ago, I'm Dominican, I would have believed that. I would have agreed with what you're saying. But I think the older I get, the more I don't really need to. I don't know, to say that I'm not white is kind of like irrelevant, bro, because I look white. And even though I have a little bit of black ancestry and I'm anti-colonial, I'm from a colonized country, you could still be white though. I guess, I don't know.
I feel like
Yeah, go ahead.
I feel, of course, you know, when you, as soon as you get deep into the, you would say, granular detail of the argument, and you see it fails completely. Because, of course, there are cultural differences among people, there are linguistic, historical, economic differences among people there. Of course, that's why, for example, you know, in scientific terms, you don't have like Asia, Latin America, and Africa all lumped together, because actually they're different places. But I feel like for the sake of liberation and for the sake of emancipation, it is so much more useful to basically try to highlight the fact, not that our experiences are dissimilar, but the fact that our objective and common aim is one and the same, which is emancipation from the system of imperialism. It is so much more fruitful that way. Of course, we can highlight the differences in the meantime, but for the sake of like actual liberation, we need to like underline, take away those differences, so like we are one and the same person. We are, you know, everybody who's not white or everybody who's not American, European, or you could say an oppressor is an oppressed person, right? And if we get all oppressed people together, then America doesn't stand a chance, because we are basically 90% of the world already, right? We're the majority.
Do you think by putting all these groups of people into one, right, into one group, do you think that you are getting rid of their nationalism? And do you think getting rid of nationalism is like a step forward towards like liberation?
Well, I've been thinking about, for example, what other people from the national liberation movements of their time said before. And Jose Marti, like one of the most important leaders of the Cuban Revolution before Fidel Castro, he said that the nations are useful as a concept, and there are fruitful differences that can be made. You can have freedom and differences, of course, in Latin America. But at the same time, what would be like more ideal, and this is his words, so at least I'm paraphrasing them, what would be more ideal is to have like a single Latin American continent, like a single, you could say, Latin American entity that can compete with other, you could say, nations on an equal manner, of course. But that, it didn't come to fruition. If Latin America was united, in, you know, from all the way to the Caribbean to the Pampa of Chile or Argentina, or from Mexico all the way down to Argentina, then it will be so much more easier for us to develop ourselves and to be sovereign, right? And that takes a new kind of nationalism to like to emerge. That takes a new kind of identity, like a collective identity that has to be like built around this idea of oppressing, not oppressing, but like standing against these systems of oppression.
So you're saying that we should reject nationalism over own specific, I guess, borders, national borders, but instead absorb a new identity, a new nationalism that includes like the whole continent, that includes basically all of this group of nations that are exploited into one, and that would be a new, I guess, a new nationalism.
Yeah.
For like the sake of liberation.
Of course, and in the word internationalism, there is the word national that is contained, right? To be like internationalist is to acknowledge the fact that your own sovereignty and independence matters, but at the same time, the independence and sovereignty of other peoples matter at the same time, as much as yours. That's, for example, in the Palestine movement, and I think this is a very correct slogan. The fact that people say Palestine will be free and that will make us free, that is a new way of thinking about how oppression works, right? And the people of Palestine, right when, for example, when Ferguson happened in this country, they said that what was happening in those, you could say, in African American communities regarding police brutality was kind of mirroring their own situation with apartheid, right? And they realized if at least African American people are not free in their country, then we can be free, right? Because one, you could say, system of oppression hinges upon the other, right? So like a new identity based around these, you could say, these similar, maybe not the similar experience, but this, you could say, new, or this common aim of liberation from all of this bullshit that is kind of shackling us. The only thing we have to lose is our chains. I think that will be like, preferably it will be like the way it is going forward. At least
Say
in
the
a
last
sense.
part again, sorry.
Which part?
That it would be like what?
It will be like, going back, I think that the basis for a new identity should be like based around losing our chains, because that is kind of like the thing we all have in common, right? Regardless if you're black or if you're Asian or if you're Latin American or if you're somewhere in between, the thing you have in common is that.
But I guess by
is
that
the chains.
logic, wouldn't you include white people too?
It depends which kind of white people, right? The oppressor white people or the oppressed white people? The oppressed white people, who are they? The people who really don't get any of the benefits of imperialism, right? You go to Eastern Europe, to the most underdeveloped parts of Eastern Europe, and those people before, you could say, before it was convenient for America to include them into whiteness, they were not considered non-whites, right? The fact that, for example, Germany in World War II tried to colonize the people of Eastern Europe because they were considered barbaric, right, means that whiteness in itself is a very frail and, you could say, weak concept. It fluctuates over time, right?
Mm-hmm.
So as long as you don't get the benefits of oppression and this historical advantage, you're no longer considered white. So it's like, it doesn't even matter if you're white or not. What matters as long as is that you are, right, you stand on the opposite side of oppression, right, against oppression. And I think the most interesting historical example of this is when, for example, the Haitian Revolution happened and the Haitian people were liberating themselves. Polish and, if I remember correctly, Polish and German mercenaries who came on behalf of the French government to quell the rebellion there, they cannot rebel against their own masters, against the French, right? And they cannot realize that their interests were much more aligned with those of the Haitian people for self-determination. The Polish people at that point didn't have self-determination, so they aligned themselves with the Haitians. And when the Haitians drafted the new constitution of the, you could say, the new Black Republic, they said that everybody who's, it doesn't really matter if you're white or if you're black, right? If you're African or if you're one of, you could say, these immigrants who came to Haiti. What matters is that you stood against, you could say, against the French, and that you helped the revolution, therefore you're black. They created a new category, right? Before it was, you could say, adopted by other countries in the world, that was no Arab, that was black. And they included the Polish and those other people, white people who held them as black too, on this basis of this new identity, right? And that is such a beautiful and inspiring example that could be adopted by every single other part of the world. You were really like serious about liberation.
I wonder what percentage of the population they would make up in Haiti though, because I can imagine if they would create a bigger part of the population, that could actually become an issue. Like if you see what's happening with Dominican Republic, like there's a white minority, there's even a lot of black people, a lot of brown-skinned people, people who clearly are not white, but they're basically having fascist tendencies.
Yeah.
And that's why I do think it could be kind of idealistic to say like we're all the same. I don't know if that's exactly what you're saying, but like, there's an aspiration. We want to be together. I agree with that. The world should be together, but I think whiteness is deep-rooted. And it's kind of dangerous, especially if we downplay it. We should be careful about that.
Of course. The biggest mistake of the Dominican people, I'm Dominican myself, right? The big mistake we have made is to understand that our positionality within the world systems is to be closer to the colonizer than to the colonized, that we're closer to being Spaniard than being, you could say, black or African, that we're closer to being, you could say, privileged than being underprivileged, right? And that has allowed us to basically use whiteness as a currency, right? Because whiteness is kind of a currency in many ways.
Couldn't that apply to the example about Eastern Europe too, though? Like even these poor whites in America, they'd be shitted on by America, but there's some of them would be like so pro-America more than others,
Yeah.
So that is a big issue for sure.
Exactly, and as just as the dollar kind of loses its importance in the world economy, because for example, this country is like so indebted to every single other country in the world. Actually, trillions and trillions of dollars are in debt, or rather America owes trillions and trillions of dollars to other countries, right? Even developing countries such as China or Brazil or even Russia to that extent. Just as the currency of this country loses importance, also whiteness as a currency will lose importance, right? For example, even in Russia, they're acknowledging, okay, we're closer to being like Eastern Europeans than actually Western Europeans, right? And with that has come a shift towards, for example, China and the systems that are being developed there against oppression, rather than a closeness to the systems of oppression they have inherited, from white supremacy, from Eurocentrism and all that shit. They don't care about that shit any longer, right? Because whiteness is no longer like a privilege anymore. Or at least we're in the transition towards a stage where like it's not really necessary to be white. in a multipolar, you could say, diverse and pluralistic world.
But going back to your original claim, wouldn't there still be anti-blackness in a lot of these countries? Even
Absolutely.
countries that could be fighting heroically against imperialism, right? I saw something about like African workers being treated really bad in Lebanon during the bombings, and they're basically like laborers, you know what I mean? And then like the families would leave them behind and stuff like that.
Yeah, I can imagine that
There's
happening.
a lot of bad stuff like that. You
I
know?
would say, just as Mao like once highlighted, there are different types of contradictions. There are antagonistic contradictions and there are complementary contradictions. I feel like the contradictions in our camp of oppressed and darker people is not antagonistic but rather complementary. We can figure this shit out without self-destroying, really. But America cannot figure it, or rather, the whole developed world cannot figure out its own problem of whiteness and how it has lost its currency in the current world and current moment without actually like deconstructing whiteness of itself and just like crumbling as an entry that is based on whiteness, right? As soon as you deconstruct whiteness, you don't have whiteness. But as soon as you deconstruct, you could say, the different contradictions we have as oppressed people, you see that, again, our positionality is closer to each other than against and separate from each other. At least in my
I
opinion.
agree. In theory, I agree. I just think there's issues that need to be worked out. But I think we agree on that.
Mhm.
Is there anything else you want to say? Or we could also bring up another topic if you have time.
Okay, let me check.
Yeah, if you want to.
I'm supposed to get a tattoo.
And then